Why did Napoleon lose in Russia? In 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte, the greatest military strategist of his time, embarked on what would become the most disastrous campaign of his career, the invasion of Russia. Up until that point, he had dominated Europe, defeating powerful coalitions, reshaping the continent, and creating an empire that stretched from Spain to Poland. But in Russia, his Grand Armée, which numbered over 600,000 soldiers, suffered a catastrophic defeat. How could such an accomplished commander lose? Why did his meticulously planned campaign end in disaster? 1. A flawed strategy and underestimation of Russia. Napoleon's military success had always relied on fast, decisive battles, where he would outmaneuver and overwhelm his enemies before they could effectively respond. However, in Russia, this strategy failed completely. Make sure to subscribe to our channel and give this video a like. This helps the YouTube algorithm promote our videos. Thank you so much. And now we continue our story. Instead of engaging in direct combat, the Russian army kept retreating, drawing the French deeper and deeper into the vast, unforgiving Russian territory. Every time Napoleon advanced, the Russians avoided a major confrontation, burning towns, crops, and food supplies as they withdrew. Napoleon had assumed that a few decisive victories would force Tsar Alexander I to surrender, as had happened with previous European rulers. But Russia refused to play by his rules. Instead, they played the long game, stretching Napoleon's forces, wearing them down, and waiting for nature to do the rest. 2. Long distances and overstretched supply lines. The French army was used to living off the land, seizing local food and supplies during campaigns. But this did not work in Russia. The Russians' scorched earth policy left the French with nothing: burned fields, abandoned villages, and no food for soldiers or horses. As the Grand Armée marched further into Russian territory, their supply lines stretched to the breaking point. Every additional mile meant more logistical nightmares. Food, ammunition, and reinforcements had to be transported across hundreds of miles of rough terrain. Many soldiers were already exhausted, starving, and suffering from disease before they even reached Moscow. By that point, the once powerful army was already severely weakened. The Pyrrhic victory at Borodino. In September 1812, Napoleon finally forced the Russians into battle at Borodino, the bloodiest engagement of the campaign. The fighting was brutal, with tens of thousands of casualties on both sides. Napoleon technically won as the Russians retreated, but it was a hollow victory. Unlike in his previous wars, where a single great battle often decided a campaign, Borodino changed nothing. The Russian army was not destroyed. They withdrew in an orderly fashion, conserving their strength. Napoleon was left with a battlefield full of dead soldiers, but no decisive breakthrough. His army was bleeding out, and yet Russia refused to surrender. The trap of Moscow. When Napoleon finally entered Moscow in September 1812, he expected to receive a peace offer from Tsar Alexander I. Instead, he found a ghost city. The Russians had evacuated, and soon after, fires broke out across Moscow, leaving it a smoldering ruin. The cause of the fires is still debated. Some say Russian troops set them deliberately, others claim they started accidentally. But their impact was devastating. With no supplies, no shelter, and no Russian surrender, Napoleon found himself trapped in a city that could not sustain his army. He waited for weeks, hoping for a diplomatic resolution. But Alexander never negotiated. As winter approached, Napoleon had no choice but to retreat, one of the greatest blunders of his military career. The Russian winter and the nightmare retreat. The retreat from Moscow began in October 1812, but Napoleon waited too long, hoping for a last-minute change in fortune. As his army marched westward, the brutal Russian winter set in. Temperatures plummeted to -30 degrees Celsius, -22 degrees Fahrenheit. Soldiers, already weak from starvation and disease, froze to death overnight. Their thin summer uniforms were useless against the freezing winds. Horses collapsed by the thousands, making it impossible to transport supplies, cannons, or the wounded. The once invincible Grand Armée collapsed into chaos. Desperate starving men abandoned their weapons, looted villages, and died in the snow. 6. Guerrilla warfare and relentless pursuit. Napoleon's greatest mistake was assuming that once he decided to leave Russia, he would be allowed to do so unopposed. Instead, the Russians made his retreat a living hell. Guerrilla fighters and Cossack raiders harassed the French day and night, picking off stragglers and cutting off supply routes. General Mikhail Kutuzov, commander of the Russian army, followed Napoleon without engaging in full-scale battle, simply ensuring that the French continued to waste away. Every river crossing turned into a nightmare as Russian forces ambushed the French, forcing them to abandon cannons, wagons, and even the wounded. In November 1812, Napoleon's forces reached the Berezina River, their last hope for survival. But the Russian army was waiting. As the French tried to cross, the Russians launched a devastating attack, annihilating what remained of the once mighty Grand Armée. Of the 600,000 soldiers who had invaded Russia, fewer than 50,000 made it back to Europe. The rest died, deserted, or were captured. 7. The beginning of Napoleon's fall. The disastrous Russian campaign shattered Napoleon's aura of invincibility. His enemies, Prussia, Austria, and Britain, now saw an opportunity. Inspired by his failure, they formed a new coalition against him. Just 2 years later, in 1814, Paris fell, and Napoleon was forced to abdicate, exiling himself to Elba. Although he would later escape and briefly regain power, the Russian disaster marked the beginning of his end. Conclusion. Why Napoleon lost in Russia? Napoleon was not defeated by superior tactics or a stronger army. He lost because of his own arrogance, poor planning, and failure to understand the vastness of Russia. He underestimated Russia's size and resilience. His army starved and froze to death due to overstretched supply lines. The Russians never surrendered, forcing him into a disastrous retreat. Guerrilla warfare, Cossack raids, and the brutal winter turned the campaign into a nightmare. Even a military genius like Napoleon could not conquer the endless Russian landscape and its relentless winter. His defeat in Russia was not just a military loss, but the beginning of the collapse of his empire.